Okay, so my boyfriend and I watched Coco, and yes, I cried like a baby. But as we talked about the movie, we had one big question that needed to be answered. But before we continue, I want to let you all know there isn't just one or two spoilers, but the whole movie will be spoiled here. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, throw this video in your to-be watched list and go fire up Disney Plus, watch it. It's so worth it. Also, there are some brief mentions of faith and religion. So if you're sensitive about your faith, know this is not an attack or belittlement of faith, just research and finding some answers about the movie. Now, for those of us cool enough to have already seen the movie, just kidding, you know you're all rad, how did De La Cruz get away with murder? Did he not go through a judgment day? Immediately, I wanted to know more about the traditions, the cultural beliefs, and I needed to know what they believed happened in the afterlife that would allow someone to get away with murder. So I began my research on El Dia de los Muertos. A super brief recap of the movie, we follow 12-year-old Miguel and his dog Dante on a journey of self-discovery. He wants to be a musician in a family that hates music.
I think we're the only family in Mexico who hates music.
When he discovers his great-great-grandfather was a famous musician, he decides to follow in his footsteps. Miguel runs away from his family on El Dia de los Muertos and ends up in the land of the dead, where he begins his search to find his ancestor, Ernesto De La Cruz. On his journey, he runs into a lot of different characters and deceased family members. Hector, who has been traveling with Miguel throughout this adventure, turns out to be the real ancestor, and he is slowly being forgotten due to his family's hatred of him. They think that Hector abandoned them, so they never spoke of him. It's super emotional. But don't worry, because it is revealed that Hector was not the bad guy. He was actually murdered by De La Cruz for his music. And Miguel, upon returning to the land of the living, revives Hector's memory and saves him from the final death. De La Cruz is exposed as a murderer and is shamed in both the land of the living and the dead. However, before the shaming, De La Cruz had a luxurious setup. He was worshipped in both lands. How? Well, I did some research and hopefully it will all make sense. So let's discuss briefly the history of the holiday. El Dia de los Muertos is celebrated from October 31st through November 2nd. It is a blend of Mesoamerican, European, and Spanish cultures. Halloween is the 31st. This is not the Day of the Dead. That starts on November 1st, when the spirits of children return to Earth for 24 hours. The spirits of adults can do the same thing on the 2nd. Thousands of years ago, the Aztecs, now modern-day central Mexico, believed that death is a part of life, and upon dying, one would travel to Chignamalacan, the land of the dead. It would take a person several years to reach the place of eternal rest, Mictlan. They would have to go through 9 levels of challenges after death, search for one's lineage, and interact with the dead. Family members would bring meals, snacks, beverages, and other supplies to help their past loved ones on this journey. This is how the Day of the Dead began. In medieval Spain, family members would put wine, flowers, and candles on the graves of their loved ones, similar to how modern-day Latin Americans make altars to commemorate their deceased family. In the 16th century, conquistadors brought these traditions to the New World. In the movie Coco, Miguel takes a similar journey through the land of the dead, facing different trials and obstacles. Granted, not ones where you have to run through a whirlwind of sharpened knives, but difficult situations for a 12-year-old nonetheless. Arguably one of Pixar's darkest movies, and spot on with cultural appropriations without losing substance. So now that we have a bit about the movie and a bit about the history of the Day of the Dead, the question still lingers: how did De La Cruz get away with murder? Now I have a theory, and it's only a theory as I'm not a writer for the film, I'm not a follower of the Latin American faith, but I am a curious researcher trying to put the pieces together of a children's movie. So the first thing I had to wrap my head around is though most of Mexico is majority Christian, they have different cultural beliefs and practices blended with their faith, just as Europeans, North Americans, Africans, and so on do as well. There's always going to be cultural influences on one's faith that is going to bleed through in different ways. The cultural hand-me-downs in Mexico from the pre-Columbian era are ever present in El Dia de los Muertos. My theory is that there isn't necessarily a judgment day like we think in terms of European Christians, with the horn and St. Peter and the pearly gates and so on, but rather the Aztec and native South American traditions. One of the biggest hints for me that they were utilizing the Aztec afterlife lore was Dante, the dog who goes to the land of the dead with Miguel. In Aztec traditions, dogs were often buried with the dead to protect and guide the spirits on their journey in death, and that's exactly what Dante did. De La Cruz wasn't judged because he was in the process of his 9 trials. In the lore of ancient Aztec traditions, these trials are challenging and gloomy. But when we toss in the European and Spanish influences, like All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day, With a more positive outlook on the journey of the afterlife, these trials seem to be depicted as less difficult and more of an experience in the continuation of life. Just as many religions and theologies have an idea of what happens to us when we die, we also know there isn't an absolute fact. We do take it on blind faith. Just as we see in the final death in Coco, when the deceased is forgotten in the land of the living, they die in the land of the dead. This is presumably where I think that the judgment takes place. Not even the dead know what happens after the final death. So the land of the dead evolved from a place of trials and tribulations to more of the old Christian view of purgatory, a waiting room for judgment. Hence why De La Cruz was still happy and famous here. The idea that being remembered would keep the dead in this purgatory for longer allowed them to return to their families and continue being a part of the lives of those living, would prolong the final judgment. I genuinely think De La Cruz knew this, which is why he didn't want Miguel to tell anyone that he murdered Hector. Not only did he refuse to give his blessing to send Miguel back to the land of the living, but he stranded him in a cave in the land of the dead, so no one there would know his secrets either. This is why De La Cruz is still beloved in the land of the dead. He simply hasn't been judged yet. His fame in the land of the living protects him from facing his sins in the final death. So in truth, I was searching for how De La Cruz got away with it, when in reality, he didn't. He simply hasn't been judged yet. And now that both the land of the living and the land of the dead know about his misdeeds, he will not soon be forgotten, but forced to be aware of the new hatred his once fans have for him. All of the gifts and luxuries he once had in the land of the dead will be stripped from him. He will have to remain aware, because he won't be forgotten, but he will be remembered in disgrace. The blending of Christianity and cultural rituals are beautifully portrayed, and I think De La Cruz, though not having faced a formal afterlife judgment day, suffers a justified end in watching his riches rust. Now that I've shared my theory, let me know your own theories about De La Cruz. Hit that like button and send us some love in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.